I was standing in the parking lot of a party supply store holding 2 balloon bouquets, one silver, one gold, when my sister texted me the address for a party I'd already RSVP'd to 3 weeks earlier. Except the address wasn't her house. It was a venue, one I'd never heard of. I called her to ask if I had the wrong information. She went quiet for a second too long, then said, "Oh, didn't Mom tell you? We moved it up. It was yesterday." I laughed, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. 2 hours later, I found out the party had been planned around me, specifically so I wouldn't be there. And that night, I made one phone call that undid 4 years of quiet sacrifice. Stay with me, because what I did next is the part nobody in my family saw coming. And if stories about people finally choosing themselves are your thing, subscribe. You don't want to miss where this one ends up. My name is Denise Holloway, and for most of my adult life I was the person other people called when they needed something handled. Not asked for help exactly, called the way you'd call a plumber. I was 44 years old that spring, single, no kids of my own, working as a project coordinator for a mid-sized logistics company in Tucson. My job, ironically, was making sure complicated things ran smoothly for people who never had to think about how. I brought that same instinct home with me every night and handed it, free of charge, to my family. I want to be honest about who I was before that Saturday, because I think it matters to understand what came after. I wasn't a martyr. I didn't walk around feeling sorry for myself. I genuinely liked being useful. There's a particular kind of satisfaction in being the person who remembers the shellfish allergy, who shows up with extra folding chairs nobody asked for, who quietly pays for the cake because nobody else thought of ordering one in time. For years, that satisfaction was enough. I told myself it was enough. I grew up the middle child in a family where my older brother got the attention for his achievements and my younger sister, Renata, got the attention for her struggles. 2 jobs, a rocky marriage to my brother-in-law Marcus, a son she was raising largely on her own in the early years. I got very little attention at all, and somewhere along the way I decided that the way to earn a place in the room was to make myself indispensable rather than interesting, helpful rather than heard. That's how I became, without ever being formally assigned the role, the aunt who showed up. Not because anyone handed me that title. It just accumulated, the way these things do when nobody stops to ask if the accumulation is fair. My nephew Eli was 6 years old the first time I watched him for a full weekend because Renata had picked up a Saturday shift she couldn't turn down. By the time he was 16, I could recite his class schedule better than she could. I was the one who remembered he was allergic to shellfish before any caterer needed reminding. I drove 2 hours each way, more times than I can count, for school plays, baseball games, and one particularly memorable middle school band concert where he played clarinet slightly, endearingly out of tune. Renata worked hard, I want to be fair to her here, and I never resented the actual work she did. What I filled in were the gaps, and I filled them without being asked, because that's what family does, or so I believed at the time. Nobody forced me into that role. I walked into it willingly over and over because it felt like love, and because for a long time it was. Eli grew into a thoughtful, slightly anxious, deeply kind teenager. He struggled with SAT anxiety in his junior year, and I was the one who talked him down at 11 at night more than once, not his parents. He wasn't the loudest kid at family gatherings, but he noticed things. He noticed, for instance, the way his father spoke to me. 2 weeks before the graduation party at a family dinner, Marcus made one of his comments, the kind engineered to get a laugh at someone else's expense. This time it was aimed at Eli's college choice, a solid-state school that wasn't flashy enough for Marcus's taste. He called it the safety school for kids who didn't try. Eli went quietly, pushing rice around his plate, his ears turning red the way they did when he was embarrassed and trying not to show it. I said evenly that the joke wasn't funny and that Eli clearly didn't think so either. The table went silent for a beat too long. Marcus rolled his eyes and told me I'd gotten too sensitive lately. Renata later told me gently, in the kitchen while we were rinsing dishes, that I'd made things awkward. I let the comment go. I always let it go. That was the pattern. Marcus threw something sharp, I caught it so it wouldn't land on Eli, and somehow I became the one who needed to apologize for catching it. I had no idea, drying that last plate, that the moment had already been filed away as evidence against me. 18 months before that graduation party, when Eli turned 16, I opened a $529 college savings account in his name. I told exactly no one what I was doing. Not Renata, not my mother, and certainly not Eli himself. I funded it quietly. A little more every month than I probably should have. I skipped 2 vacations I'd been planning. I drove my car 2 full years past when I should have traded it in, listening to a check engine light I'd learned to argue with. I picked up freelance project work on weekends I could have spent resting. None of it felt like sacrifice at the time, it felt like building something. By the morning of Eli's graduation party, the account held just over $61,000. I hadn't told him the exact figure. That was intentional. I wanted to hand him the account statement myself, in person, in front of everyone who loved him, and watch his face do the thing faces do when a number like that becomes real instead of abstract. I'd pictured it for months, the exact second his eyes would land on the total. I'd pictured his mother's face too, and I'll admit, some small part of me had pictured Marcus's face, the moment he'd realized the safety school kid had an aunt who believed in him more than his own father seemed to. That gift wasn't wrapped in paper. It didn't fit in a box. It was a folder sitting on my passenger seat that Saturday morning, next to 2 balloon bouquets I'd chosen carefully, silver and gold, because I thought they'd photograph well next to Eli's cap and gown. I had no idea I would never get to open that folder in front of anyone at all. That Saturday didn't feel like the beginning of anything. I'd set an alarm for 7 a.m., even though the party wasn't until 2, because I am, and have always been, the person who shows up early to set things up and leaves last to make sure the lights are off. I live in a small rental outside Tucson, the kind of place with a single strip of desert hardy grass out front that I water twice a week out of stubbornness more than hope. That morning the sky was doing the thing Arizona skies do in late spring, a flat, bleached white that promises heat before the sun even clears the roofline. I made coffee, showered, and put on the outfit I'd chosen 2 weeks earlier. Nice enough for photos, comfortable enough for a full day of party logistics, because I always ended up doing the logistics. I was loading the balloon bouquets into my back seat when I called Renata to confirm the time. That's when she told me the venue had changed, and almost as an afterthought, that the party itself had already happened. Yesterday. Without me. We didn't want to make a big thing out of switching the date, she said, in the voice she uses when she wants bad news to sound like a minor scheduling note. It just came together easier that way. I asked her carefully what easier meant. There was a pause. Then Marcus took the phone. He didn't soften anything. Honestly. It was a better party without the tension, he said. You've been really intense lately. I stood in that parking lot holding a silver balloon that kept nudging the side of my face, and I listened to my brother-in-law explain, in a handful of blunt sentences, that my presence had become a liability at family events. That I corrected people too much. That they'd wanted one easy afternoon. He said it the way you'd explain moving a meeting. Practical, almost reasonable, as if I were a scheduling conflict and not a person who'd spent 18 months quietly building his son's future. I didn't defend myself. I didn't list the recitals, the late-night talks about SAT anxiety, the years of showing up early and leaving last. Something in me had already gone very still and very quiet. I just said, okay, and hung up. I sat in my car in that parking lot for 11 minutes without starting the engine. The balloons drifted slightly in the back seat every time the air conditioning kicked on. A small, stupid detail that somehow made the whole thing feel more real than anything Marcus had said. I remember watching them bob in the rearview mirror and thinking, absurdly, that I should have gotten balloons that didn't outlast their welcome. I hadn't told anyone about the exact number in that college account. It had been my plan to hand Eli the folder myself at the party, in front of everyone. Now there was no in front of everyone. There was just me, 2 balloon bouquets, and a folder on my passenger seat that suddenly felt less like a gift and more like a question I hadn't finished asking myself. Why was I still giving everything to people who had already decided they were better off without me in the room? I didn't drive home. I drove nowhere in particular, which is how, 40 minutes later, I ended up passing a community youth center I donated to twice through work. A place that ran a mentorship program for teenagers aging out of foster care, Kids who applied to college with excellent grades and nowhere near enough support to actually get there. I don't fully know what made me pull into that lot. Maybe it was the folder still sitting on the passenger seat, silently accusing me of nothing and everything. Maybe it was just needing somewhere to put my hands that wasn't back in that family group chat, which I could already feel filling up with messages I wasn't ready to read. Inside, a program coordinator named Priya was setting out folding chairs for an evening info session, the metal legs scraping against the linoleum in a rhythm that was oddly soothing. I told her honestly that I had some money set aside for a family member's education and that the plans around it had just changed. I asked what it would take to redirect a scholarship-style gift toward a student in her program instead. Someone who had the drive but not the safety net. She didn't oversell it to me. She asked good, practical questions. How the funds were structured, whether I wanted a say in who received it, what strings I wanted attached. I told her I didn't want to choose a name myself. I wanted the program's existing selection process, grades, need, character references, to decide, not my anger and not my grief. That distinction mattered to me more than anything else that day. I want to be very clear about this, because it's the part I'd want anyone in my situation to understand. I wasn't trying to punish my nephew. Eli hadn't done anything wrong. He probably didn't even know the party had moved. This was never about him. It was about refusing to keep pouring myself into a family that had already decided my presence was optional and my contributions were mandatory. I didn't withdraw a single dollar that afternoon. I told Priya I needed a week to think it through properly, with an actual advisor. Not a parking lot decision made an hour after getting my heart handed to me. She respected that completely, and something about her not pushing, not trying to close the sale on my grief, made me trust the whole thing more. Over the following days, the family group chat filled with messages I didn't answer right away. Renata insisted nobody had meant to exclude me permanently, as if exclusion came in acceptable doses like medication. My mother called twice and left voicemails asking me to stop being dramatic before it ruins Eli's summer, which told me exactly whose comfort mattered most in this story, and it wasn't mine. It was my niece Callie, 17, usually the quiet one at these gatherings, the kind of quiet that means she's paying closer attention than anyone realizes, who told me the part nobody else would. She said the date change hadn't been sudden. It had been decided the weekend before, deliberately, and Renata had told the rest of the family I had other plans, so nobody would ask questions. Nobody had texted me that evening either. Not one "wish you were here." Not even a photo. That detail sat with me longer than Marcus's cruelty had. Cruelty, at least, is honest. This was something quieter. The assumption that I would simply absorb it, the way I'd absorbed everything else for years, and still be there for the next birthday, the next holiday, the next favor, showing up early, leaving last. Forever the reliable background noise of everyone else's celebrations. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about every recital, every 2-hour drive, every late-night phone call talking Eli down from a panic spiral, and I thought about how none of it had ever bought me a permanent seat in the room. It had only bought me a temporary one, revocable whenever my presence became inconvenient. A week later, I met with a financial advisor and restructured the account. I want to walk through exactly how, because the details mattered to me morally, not just financially. Eli's original contributions, the ones I'd made purely as gifts with no conditions, going back to when he was 14, long before any of this happened, I left completely untouched. That money had always been his, no strings, and I wasn't going to make it retroactively conditional just because I was hurt. Punishing Eli for his parents' choices would have made me no better than the people who'd excluded me. But the larger fund I'd been building specifically toward that graduation day revealed the bulk of it, the part tied to that imagined moment in front of everyone. I redirected to the Youth Center Scholarship Program. We structured it as an annual renewing award, chosen entirely by their selection committee. I never asked for names. I never asked to meet recipients unless they wanted to meet me. I didn't want a plaque. I didn't want a thank you card with my name spelled correctly on it. I wanted the money to matter more than my need to be seen giving it. Signing those papers didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that too, since I think revenge stories sometimes lie about how satisfying the turn actually feels in the moment. It felt like grief with a signature on it. But it also felt like the first decision I'd made in years that was entirely, unapologetically mine. I won't pretend there wasn't grief in it. I'd pictured Eli's face for months, the exact moment he'd open that folder. Letting go of that specific imagined moment took longer than letting go of my anger at Marcus. Anger, it turns out, is the easy part. It's the small stolen future you'd built in your head that's hard to bury. My relationship with Renata didn't end, but it changed shape, the way a bone changes shape after it breaks and heals slightly crooked. She apologized eventually, and it was a real apology, not a performance. She admitted she'd gone along with moving the date because it was easier than saying out loud that Marcus didn't want me there, and that easier had mattered more to her in that moment than I had. I told her I appreciated the honesty more than the apology itself. Honesty, I've learned, is the only apology that actually holds weight. Marcus never apologized for anything beyond how it came across, which is its own kind of answer. I stopped expecting him to. Some people will never see the difference between being excluded and being managed, and I stopped spending my energy trying to teach him. Eli, for what it's worth, eventually found out the whole story. Not from me, but from Callie, who I think has a stronger moral compass than half the adults in our family combined. He called me himself, upset on my behalf in a way that genuinely surprised me. His voice cracking a little the way it used to when he was younger and overwhelmed. He told me he wished I'd told him what I'd originally planned. I told him the truth. It was never about the exact number. It was about wanting him to know someone believed in his future enough to build something toward it quietly, without needing credit for it. He still has his own account, untouched, exactly as I'd always meant it. A gift, not a bargaining chip, and certainly not a weapon. The following spring, the youth center sent me a short note. The first scholarship recipient was a 19-year-old named Bianca, a former foster kid studying civil engineering, who'd never met me and never would need to know my family's names to use that money well. I never learned more than that, and I didn't ask to. I'd already gotten the only thing I actually needed from the whole ordeal. Proof that generosity doesn't require an audience, and that being wanted isn't something you can buy your way into with a folder full of good intentions. I still go to family things. I still bring dessert. But now I go because I'm asked, not because I've quietly made myself impossible to leave out. And that difference, it turns out, is worth more than any number I could have written on a check. Now a final word for anyone who sees themselves in this. If you've read this far, there's a decent chance some part of this story landed close to home. Maybe you're the one who remembers everyone's allergies, who shows up early and leaves last, who has quietly funded, fixed, or carried something for a family that has never once asked what you needed in return. Here's what I'd want you to know if you're standing in your own version of that parking lot right now. Being indispensable is not the same thing as being loved. You can spend 20 years making yourself impossible to replace and still, in a single afternoon, discover you were never actually irreplaceable to the people who mattered most. Only convenient. That distinction is painful, but it's also freeing, because it means the problem was never that you weren't generous enough, early enough, or patient enough. The problem was that generosity was being mistaken by everyone around you for an obligation instead of a gift. You don't have to burn anything down to reclaim yourself. I didn't destroy my nephew's future to make a point. I redirected my own generosity toward people who would actually receive it as the gift it was always meant to be. That's the quiet, less cinematic kind of justice, but it's real and it lasts. Redirecting your love isn't cruelty. It's just finally aiming it somewhere it will be received with the same care you put into giving it. So if you're the family's safety net and nobody's priority, take this as permission. You're allowed to stop applying for a seat at a table that keeps moving without telling you. Build your folder. Fund your future or someone else's who will actually see it. Just make sure that whoever finally opens it is someone who was glad every single time that you were in the room. If this story hit home, you know someone who spent years being everyone's safety net and nobody's priority. Send it to them. And subscribe, the next one might be the story you needed to hear.